So, let's do this. Landlords versus everybody. A biased production. This looks very well produced. This is content. Recycling old content is content. Reacting to content is content, apparently.
You're cool. You're current. You're online. You've gone on Twitter. If you're watching this, you've probably been in some pretty contentious online spaces. So you've definitely seen people immediately lose their collective coconuts as soon as landlords are brought up. One group starts yelling about
Lo-fi too loud? Okay.
leeches and parasites. Another group starts talking about how if you don't want to rent, you need to get a better job and buy a house. Some loser centrist tries to calm the discourse by saying at least landlords provide homes to live in for those who can't afford them. And I log off and watch She-Ra.
They don't provide. Hi,
It's a
bad
contentious
girl
topic
Riley.
for
That's
sure.
the whole thing. First off, we have to stop letting landlords justify their price gouging and tenant exploitation practices because they think that they are offering some sort of service to tenants that wouldn't be offered otherwise. Now, because of the system and the way that it's designed, part of that is true, and that's because the government has failed to act responsibly and provide subsidized, affordable, or public housing to the general public, right? I think it's really important to highlight it's really important to highlight that landlords are not necessarily they're not a godsend just because they found an avenue where they could make an investment that ultimately profited them in the long run that they could capitalize off of. They think that somehow this is a symbiotic relationship where they are offering a roof over tenants' heads in exchange for rent that might be well over the cost of the housing unit itself, right? Or well beyond. So you can tell that based on a landlord's profit margins. How much is a landlord putting toward that mortgage? How much money are they putting in property taxes and other expenditures? And then how much money are they walking away with or receiving excess profits once they make all of their payments? Okay, I'm going to stop talking.
And that passion probably comes from the fact that everybody either is a renter, a landlord, or knows one. I used to engage in these debates online, but it was really too personal to ever really be a reasonable discussion.
There we go.
So, here we are. My preferred form of communication, where I'm the only one talking. So let's get into it. Why are landlords bad? Well, for the purpose of this video,
just kidding, I did have some munchies earlier.
Who purchase property for the purpose of renting it to others. I'm not including people who rent out single rooms in their homes and live with these roommates. I'm also not saying landlords are necessarily bad people. I'm saying they're doing bad things. I mean that the act of being a landlord is an immoral act. And that in order to accept that being a landlord is a moral practice, you also have to accept that systemic causes of homelessness, that exploitation, and that coerced legal contracts created under duress are also moral. I need you to do something for me during this video, partly an experiment that requires your imagination, but also just something to keep reminding yourself of. People who advocate against landlords and for housing reform are looking for sweeping, radical change. What you need to imagine is a different kind of world. This is a question of morality, not morality under capitalism. Put a pin in that. If landlords are doing something immoral, what is it? Why is letting someone live on your property so wrong? Obviously, you're going to charge them. You bought the house so that you could charge them. You silly dinkus lib turd. Well, let's break this down. Why does a landlord rent a property out? Well, that one's simple: to increase their wealth, to make money. The motivation is profit. Most people would argue that it's also a real estate investment. You buy or mortgage the property and then you rent it out until it's paid off. Then you own it. You can maybe sell it for more. There's nothing wrong with working to make money. That last part I agree with. So what work or labor does being a landlord require? What is the base job description of a landlord? Well, they don't have a job description of the work they do because it's not a job. They don't do anything. Like most investments, you supply capital and you hope to see a return on it. Now, some of the smaller landlords with only a few properties do things themselves. They might do general maintenance on their properties, they might do repairs, and I agree, both of those things are labor. But they aren't a landlord's labor. They're a maintenance worker's labor, a repair person's labor. And they should be fairly compensated for that labor, of course. But I can guarantee you, I'm not paying someone $1,300 a month to check my smoke alarm once a year. It's pretty clear that what you're paying for is not that manual labor. They're using the money you give them to fix their own property of which you have no rights over or ownership of. And that's why you'll hear people calling landlords leeches, because they take something you will not get back and do not give you anything you get to keep. They're passively taking the profits of your labor from you. So leech seems kind of harsh, right?
No.
Like you're calling someone a blood-sucking slug.
Yeah.
And I'm sure people do kind of mean that literally, but I more so mean the other definition of leech: to extort profit from or sponge on others. Or a parasite, the dependence on something else for existence or support without making a useful or adequate return. Or a yerk, 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 or a yerk. If you're joining me from the other side of the political spectrum and you're of the mind that people shouldn't get things they don't work for, like homes, then you should also oppose landlords who get a house with no labor.
That's right.
TLDR, a landlord is someone who does not labor, but who takes the profits from a renter's labor to maintain the landlord's property, which further enriches the landlord's own wealth and status. A lot of landlords don't even own the property they're renting to you. They're paying off a mortgage on it. The landlord is basically a middleman between a bank and the person needing a place to live. Instead of paying a bank a monthly mortgage and paying for any occasional repair yourself, you pay your landlord a monthly rent. And instead of at the end of this mortgage, you get a house and a place to live forever. Your landlord gets a house and you get to go do it all again. I would say starting from scratch, but as a renter, you never get past scratch. It's scratch all the way down.
Wait, it's all bullshit? Yeah, always has been. So here's how this works. You make a profit.
The whole reason why owning a home to begin with is so desirable, and it's the reason why you have your fair share of regular people want to own a home one day, it's because your money that you're putting towards your mortgage ultimately leads to home equity that will allow you to own the home outright once your mortgage is paid off. And if the appraised value of the land where your house sits on does increase exponentially, then you will have a nice hefty return on your own investment that you have made from your home, from your mortgage, right? It's the same exact concept with landlords, right? Landlords are paying off a mortgage that will ultimately give them home equity on their building or their structure that they can either sell if they pay off their mortgage and appreciation sets in and they end up getting a nice return on their investment. In the meantime, it's not like they are paying their mortgage with their own money. They are taking the rent or extracting the rents from their tenants to both pay the mortgage, make a profit off of those rents, and then ultimately get the equity on the home once the mortgage is paid off, right? Now, we all know this. This is just me repeating myself. We've talked about this multiple times, but that's the reason why we call landlords leeches, right? Because they are, in a way, extracting or extorting money from their tenants, and they are not actually paying their mortgage. They are using that money to pay their mortgage, and then on top of that, they are taking whatever is left, and then that's the money that goes into their own pocket, right? Once it's paid off, your monthly bills drop drastically. Yeah, so like the trade-off, and this is the justification, that by the time you pay off a mortgage 30 years later, then the apartment starts to depreciate. The structure, while you have an appreciation of land where the building sits, the building itself depreciates, right? Where you have to put in a little bit more money for maintenance. Structural deficiencies will start to kick in, and so the money that you are then taking from your tenants will then have to go toward maintenance and upkeep, right? And that's, one thing that tenants will also bring to your attention as well, as if it still somehow reaches a moment of equilibrium. You're still taking the money that you are receiving from your tenants, and you're paying your own bills or paying to make those fixes with your tenants' money.
But your employer at work, and then they give you a wee little sliver of that back as wages. Then you save up all those slivers for months and you give them to a landlord as a deposit for an apartment. You get tenancy of the apartment temporarily, and the landlord can start using your money to pay off their mortgage. And then we repeat that until the landlord has paid off their home, and then we can start the whole process over again. Which leaves your employer, your landlord, and the bank all wealthier, and you get to keep nothing. You're a resource that's being exploited for someone's personal gain, and it's not your own.
Okay. I know you have a lot of arguments to make, a lot of ways you either want to justify how landlords need to exist, should be allowed to exist, or even good, actually. Well, aren't you clever? Let's take a gander. Argument 1. It's a business, and businesses charge more than the actual worth to profit. That's just how it works. First off, remember when I told you need to think outside of the current system to imagine a world where things are different? This is one of those times. Secondly, I believe you may have confused me with someone who thinks profiting off of the labor of people without appropriate compensation is okay. Let's clear that up. I don't think that's okay. Just like our bosses, the way a landlord makes money under capitalism is to make as much money as possible by spending as little money as possible, maximizing profits. Well, businesses will charge their customers as much as they can get away with and pay their employees as little as they possibly can. Then they try to cut corners, cut costs, create lean business models that often require people to do exponentially more work in less time for the same amount of money. Landlords, well, they charge you as much rent as they can get and increase it as much as they can thereafter. They can also cut corners. My landlord did that in one way by giving everyone kitchen drawers that fall apart in 6 to 7 months. Once a year, they send a minimum wage maintenance person to come glue them all back together. It's like, it's not even cutting corners. It's like, you're cutting so many corners that we just made a goddamn circle. You only stopped cutting corners because there were no corners left to cut. So with all their profits maximized after using renters' income for years to pay off their own house, a lot of landlords just do it again. Get another house, pay it off. Get another house, pay it off. Now, let's be generous and put all that exploitation aside if you can. Being a business wouldn't preclude you from being immoral. Businesses have material consequences on the world, and those consequences are largely a product of the conduct of that particular business. A business can be really good for the surrounding community, but have a terrible environmental impact on a community nearby. Both of those communities might feel very differently about the usefulness and morality of that business. A business that serves a community may severely mistreat its employees, Or it could be a mom and pop shop that pays their employees very well and does community outreach. It could be one Etsy lesbian selling ridiculous earrings but only out of recycled object. If you do that, let me know. I want to buy. The policies and practices of that business determine its effect on the community and the world. And that is what determines where it stands on a scale of moral to immoral. You don't get to claim that you're above moral scrutiny because you file taxes as a business and you have a Squarespace. I keep talking about consequences and effects determining morals, so let's lay it out there. What are the consequences of landlords on a base level? The effects of simply buying property for the purpose of renting it. This isn't about some landlords doing crappy repairs, just in case you were going to hashtag not all landlords me. Let's look at a study done on the real world effects of landlords on renters in the US between 2001 and 2015. This isn't including the effects of landlords during a global pandemic, for instance. The first obvious consequence of landlords, rent burden.
Samantha
For
Banana.
the purpose of the following statistics, rent burden is when you spend 30% or more of your pre-tax income on rent. In 2015, 38% of all renter households were rent burden, an increase of about 19% from 2001. The share of renter households that were severely rent burdened, spending 50% or more of monthly income on rent, increased by 42% between 2001 and 2015 to 17%. What that means is that people are paying more than they should be for rent, and that number is increasing rapidly.
Yep.
So even with any pay increases, any promotions at work, the rental prices overwhelmingly exceed any additional money being brought in. The burden remains and increases. Americans have less money available for other needs than they did 20 years ago. In 2015, 46% of African American-led renter households were rent burdened, compared with 34% of white households. Between 2001 and 2015, the gap between the share of white and African American households experiencing severe rent burden grew by 66%. Senior-headed renter households are more likely than those headed by people in other age groups to be rent burdened. In 2015, about 50% of renter families headed by someone over 65 were rent burdened, and more than a fifth were severely rent burdened. Rent burdened households are also financially insecure in many other ways.
Of course. That's why
Half
they're
had
rent
less
burdened.
than $10 in savings across various liquid accounts, while half of homeowners had more than $7,000.
Another thing that is explaining a higher increase of rent burden tenants are the decreases in naturally affordable housing units that could be due to older buildings that are in lower income communities becoming so dilapidated that they are no longer passing code and they are past the point of revival and they have to be demolished. Also, for some of those affordable housing structures that might have been built for subsidized housing, they might have received government-backed mortgages that incentivized landlords to purchase and provide affordable housing. Once those mortgages are up, they can then convert these units into market rate units as well. That's another way that we have lost naturally affordable housing in this country. And because the government has failed to make up the difference in the loss of naturally affordable housing, then low-income renters are forced to go into the private market and rent at fair market rates, and that causes them to put more of their already low income toward their rent, and it only exponentially makes the share of rent burdened tenants even higher, right? It only exacerbates the issues that low-income tenants were already facing. K-State Nate, thank you so much for resubscribing. Oh, 12 months in a row. Thank you, K-State Nate. Puggies. All right.
Means that Black and senior renters are more likely to face harsher rent burdens and have an increasingly smaller chance as time goes on to get out of that permanent burden state. And that homeowners just casually have 1,700 times more in liquid assets.
I'm happy I took my house back from a landlord who was buried under a mortgage he couldn't pay, and he couldn't find tenants for his place to pay for. Uh-oh. It sounds pretty poggers, to be honest. Poggers.
Rent burden households transitioned from renting to owning in 2015 than in 2001. Households that were rent burdened for at least a year were less likely to buy a home than those that never experienced a rent burden.
Right.
A single year of paying 30% of your income or more on rent can mean that you're less likely to ever buy a home.
And that also has to do with the fact that you do not have liquid capital that you have accumulated that you can save to put toward a down payment on a home, right? Especially after the subprime mortgage collapse, whenever banks did kind of clean up their qualifications, it became a little bit, and the stringency after the subprime mortgage collapse, where it wasn't so easy to qualify for a mortgage, meaning that you absolutely had to have some percentage of a down payment instead of ninja loans or piggyback loans that were offered during the housing bubble period. And if you were already experiencing a rent burden, that meant that you were probably already considered a low-income tenant anyway, right? So of course it's going to be way harder for you to qualify for a mortgage if you don't have that certain amount of money set aside for a down payment.
The study found that rents in some cities are so high that people of all income levels, including those with higher than average salaries, are competing for the same small number of apartments. And that's including the ones they will be under a rent burden in, not just the affordable ones. And that's the second consequence of landlords buying property to rent it out for a profit. People are much less likely to ever be able to purchase a home because they spend so much on rent that they can't save. And that one financial hit could wipe them out. Which leads us to the next consequence. Everyone struggles when rents rise, but those at the bottom of the economic ladder struggle the most. Even small increases in rent can push low-income families into homelessness. According to the report, people in communities where the average renter spends more than 30% of their income on rent, meaning their rent burden, are particularly vulnerable to rapid increases in homelessness rates. Prior research has also shown a link between high rents and homelessness. Rent-burdened households tend to be more financially precarious than those that spend a smaller percentage of their income on rent. These people will also have higher rates of eviction, which makes them more likely to experience homelessness. In places where the average person is rent-burdened, homelessness skyrockets, which is lunacy. Lunacy! Because if landlords provide housing, homelessness should go down as the amount of landlords increase, right? In Ontario, where I live, spending any time homeless is also extremely difficult to come back from because social assistance only offers $340 per month to single adults without a home, which is obviously too little to ever rent a place or even a room with. And then we have the worst consequence, because homelessness...
Did they go over this? Did they go over the fact that somebody who was paid a minimum wage in this country wouldn't be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment set at market rate in any city in this country? Let me repeat that. An employee or a worker making minimum wage in this country would not be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in this country. At market rate. Or in any major city. What about a 1-bedroom? Yeah, one bedroom's different. So let me say this one more time, because I know that what I'm about to say is 100% correct, and maybe what I just said wasn't. A worker paid minimum wage in this country could not afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any city in this country. There we go.
Homelessness can fucking kill you.
Yep.
In Los Angeles County, homeless people are dying in record numbers. 918 people who were homeless died in 2018 alone, and deaths jumped 76% between 2014 and 2018. The rate of people dying of homelessness is outpacing the rate of new people becoming homeless.
Also, during COVID-19, the total number of houseless individuals dying has increased. It was 3 people in Los Angeles were dying a day. Now that COVID-19 has completely plagued Los Angeles County, it is now on average 4 houseless individuals dying a day in LA.
I have never heard a sound moral justification for someone living under the threat of dying of exposure on the streets because they couldn't afford to buy someone else a house. If you have one, feel free to leave it in the comments. If you're not a shitlord about it, I'll probably even respond. Again, I need you to imagine a different world, one where housing is not only a human need, but a human right. In a world where we do not treat homes like something that is permissible to profit off of, involuntary homelessness disappears. You've probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs during these discussions, in which shelter is a base need. I personally would probably add alcohol and raw dogging Twinks on there, but I guess everybody has their own individual needs as well. But outside of that theory, housing is actually recognized by the Canadian government as a social determinant of health. What does that mean? I didn't know. So I asked a much more educated friend of mine who works in the shelter system to explain it to me. Here's what they told me. Social determinants of health are factors that, in combination, determine how mentally and physically well a person can be in our society. Social determinants of health have consequences on each other as well as on our wellness as a whole. So not having a home also makes us less healthy. It makes us less likely to be able to find or keep a job, to go to school, access social supports, access community or health supports, etc. Homelessness also increases risk of traumatic events, naturally, in addition to being traumatic in itself. So no home equals poor health equals greater difficulty rectifying your homelessness and or any of its associated issues. Now that we know the consequences of the choice between being rent burdened or homeless, that leads us to our next common defense of landlords. Signing a lease is voluntary, and you get to choose which landlord you rent from. You have so many options. You need to make good choices. There's a couple of things going on here. Firstly, that nobody is being forced to rent. Well, when the option is homelessness or renting, you're renting under the threat of homelessness. Unless a bank is willing to give you a mortgage when you're working minimum wage and have no money to put down because you've been rent burdened for the last 10 years, then yes, you have to rent. So you don't really have a choice in whether or not you have a landlord. But you do get to choose your landlord, right? Well,
you get to submit an application that usually costs anywhere from $35 to $50 for a property manager or a corporate landlord to look at whether or not you qualify based on your income, based on your tenant history. And then if you pass the tests, if you meet all of the standards, then you might be selected. Let me tell you something. Whenever I first moved here, because I had not worked at my place of employment long enough, I was denied. My application was denied. All right. So from personal experience, I know that you have the right to search. If time is not on your side, though, you could be desperate to go with any options that will give you a place to live. And that might mean having to put more of your income toward your rent. Right? And even then, if you make the decision to dedicate a little bit more of your income toward rent, there's no guarantee that you will meet the criteria that is put into place by a property owner who is reviewing your application. So yeah, it actually costs money. Money that you might not have as a low-income renter to be even considered for a vacant unit. And for a lot of low-income renters, we don't have a lot of time to spare to find the best deal at the most competitive price based on our own monthly income that we can put toward our rents. Because again, we don't have temporary shelters. We don't have social safety nets in this country. We don't have a lot of opportunities for low-income housing or public housing. So these are all the burdens that you are expected to bear as a tenant. And it's not a comfortable process. It can be quite expensive, depending on how many applications you're putting in for a unit of your choice or whatever fits your budget. Let's keep it going.
Maybe sometimes. Kind of. Yeah, maybe. Sometimes. But not really, because when you go to rent a house or apartment, you don't know who you're renting from. They ask for everything up to your third grade report card, but they're not required to present anything to you at all about their history as a landlord.
Right.
You have no credit check for landlords. They don't provide you references. They don't give you anything you have to give them. And should you refuse to rent from them without the information needed to make an informed decision, they could just not give you the apartment just because you're more work than the other applicants.
Right.
In this situation, it's an incredibly unequal power dynamic, and they have all of it. Homes are a basic human need, and as such, you'll have to accept either whatever landlord will rent you in short notice, or you could be homeless.
Right.
And because landlords all work in a market, the choice between landlords is nearly meaningless anyways. All landlords are going to profit off you passively. Some maybe even worse than that. Here's a hypothetical. What if your current landlord asked you to move out because their son wants to move in, which is a legal reason in Toronto for a landlord to make you move out? Whether it's true or not, you'd have to find out yourself after you've already been forced out of the place. So now you're fracked. What do? You have $400 or less in your checking account. You can't afford first and last deposit. You have no assets to sell. It's not feasible to live on the streets, and in a lot of places you're not even allowed to, let alone living on the streets in places like Canada where the weather can mean certain death.
True.
So you're probably thinking, well, that's why we have homeless shelters. I asked my friend about this too. This is what they told me, and I confirmed. The city of Toronto has eliminated around 1,000 shelter spaces since the beginning of the pandemic in order to allow for some degree of social distancing, which is still not even sufficient. They've now introduced 500 or so new temporary spaces for the winter in order to meet increased demand.
But activists are estimating there are 1,500 people outside right now. 100 of those new beds are at a temporary respite site on the exhibition grounds, and it's being completely slammed.
I'd just like to point out here that people on Twitter have compared it to the prison in Deadpool 2. What a great look. Would love to live in a glass box with no privacy while I'm being monitored 24 hours a day, surrounded by people that may or may not have the plague. But you may say, you're proposing a false dichotomy. It's not renting or homelessness. It's renting or buying or homelessness. You could buy your own house. Great point. But only some people are able to buy a house to live in. Often they're people with enough generational wealth or privilege to have good credit, assets, a stable, well-paying job, and enough money to afford a down payment. They're mostly middle-class, heterosexual couples with a higher household income. White ones. Of the people who actually buy homes and aren't white, 15% are under 36, 12% are between 52 and 70, and 7% are over 71. So landlords in general...
You know what the worst part is with the housing bubble, Chad? Is that We don't necessarily know how some of these fates would have turned out if loan officers issued the same kind of sweetheart deals to the type of homeowners that this gentleman has just described. I don't know the pronouns. I shouldn't make an assumption, right? Instead of how they acted in a predatory manner and they issued subprime mortgages explicitly and exclusively to lower income people of color. And once the adjustable rate on their mortgage kicked in, that's whenever they were no longer able to make their mortgage payment. That's what caused them to default on their home loans. That's ultimately why they were foreclosed upon and they lost their homes and had to file bankruptcy, because the cost of the interest that ended up rising exponentially with those adjusted interest rates was too big of a burden to bear. And whenever one makes the argument that, well, if you don't like renting, why don't you just own a home? Well, that's the crux of the housing bubble and the reason why it ultimately collapsed. It's because loan officers doled out these shitty mortgages exclusively to low-income community members of color. They gave better deals to whites, heterosexual couples who already had pretty good credit scores and had enough money to provide a down payment, right? Now, it's no guarantee that if every single person received the same kind of interest on their mortgage as these desirable, more favorable couples that loan officers tend to provide better mortgages to, that we wouldn't have had a bubble burst in the first place, because that's absolutely not the case at all. The fact of the matter is that we just know that because so many subprime mortgages were targeting lower income communities of color, we don't know if they would have been able to make their mortgage payments if their adjustable interest rate didn't rise exponentially a year or a few years into their mortgage, that would have allowed them to be able to pay off their mortgage, stay in their homes, and not have to default and ultimately foreclose their homes once it became too unaffordable of a mortgage payment, right? So we can definitely see that disparity looking back from an historical context, where those who were better suited to be able to pay their mortgages anyway got better deals on their loans, right? Why is that? Why were they favored by loan officers in the way that they were whenever they were already in a better position to afford their mortgages, right? This has been the case, though, from the very beginning, that even policies like redlining have been written to favor your nuclear family, right? White families, that allowed them to get those sweetheart deals, move into the suburbs, go through the period of white flight, while the rest of homeowners or the rest of renters in low-income communities specifically never even had the chance to qualify for a mortgage. We're seeing history repeat itself. This is just a new age of redlining in many respects. Okay. Dead horsey? Dead.
Are much more likely to be renting to people of color, as people of color are less likely to be able to afford a home, probably because they're rent burdened. You might counter with, Caelan, if you're saying renters are paying someone else's mortgage, then these people are too poor to pay a mortgage, so they should just go do that and stop choosing to pay a landlord. Well, that would be...
Also, to be clear, if you're rent burdened, you're most likely low income. And that has more to do with the reason why you wouldn't afford a mortgage. If you wouldn't qualify because you have, you have low income status, that would be the most prominent reason why in today's world, banking world, you would not qualify for a mortgage.
Great if banks did not have a long, blatant history of discrimination against minorities. It would work so well if a down payment was something the average rent-burdened person with $400 in their account could afford. See, as long as you're rent-burdened, you're trapped unless some other aspect of your life drastically improves for the better. because as we've seen, rent increases faster than the average person's wages. If the minimum wage kept up with the inflation of rental and housing costs, most people might be able to escape living with rent burden. But instead, for example, you can rent the same place for years and years, pay the entire mortgage of a house, and walk away with nothing. No generational wealth, no bank willing to lend, no ability to save because your rent increase outpaced your wage increases over the time you lived there. And that's by design. They give you just enough to survive sometimes. Because as long as you can survive, you can work. And as long as you're lulled into a sense of exhausting...
You have to have a good credit score. You have to have a certain percentage for a down payment. 10% is the standard, or it has been for quite some time. And you have to have proof of income that you will be able to continue to pay the rent, or pay the mortgage. So you have to evidence steady employment, right? Promising employment that you will be able to continue to pay off a 30-year mortgage. In addition to, having liquid capital available that can go directly into a down payment, so that you're good for at least 10% of the total value of the home. FHA loans help immensely. There's a finite amount of FHA loans, though. But yes, they do. You have programs that are specifically put into place to offer low-income individuals who are interested in owning a home the opportunity to own a home if they qualify based on their low-income status with much more affordable mortgages. But those are not as available as we would hope. Debt to income ratio too, student loans messes that up. Yes. So thank you, because that's absolutely true. If you've incurred another type of substantial debt, then that could also hurt you. But they look at your history of payment as well. In some cases, if you've been really good about paying your monthly student loan bills, then that could help you in some respects. But again, it can be really difficult to incur multiple burdens of debt, especially during these trying times. But there's also a silver lining with having proven that you can take on debt and pay off your debt in a responsible manner. In fact, you do have to, your credit score, the only way to receive a credit score is to evidence that you've taken out a line of credit or some sort of debt burden, and you have shown that you can pay it off. That's pretty much how you even get a credit score at this point. So debt is required in many respects to qualify for other loans. Also, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Wilco.
Complacency, you'll continue working and you'll continue renting.
You give almost everything and you keep almost nothing.
Literally just existing to make other people more wealthy by giving you the least they can and taking from you the most they can. That can't be the landlord's fault too, right? Of course it can. Of course it can. Of course it is. Each time someone rents a house, it's one less house that can be bought, which increases the demand for houses because supply is lower. Which means they can now raise the price because they have more leverage. Which means that each house that's bought to be used by a landlord helps increase the price of houses altogether. Which means that houses become even more unaffordable to people without pre-existing capital and for renters to rent. Which means
landlords are leeches. Rip them off for good. Or they'll do it to you.
they're willing to eat front-end costs because they know it'll be paid off by someone else. And the more properties they own, the faster they increase their own wealth and assets, and the faster you lose yours in rent. It creates a permanent class of renters to whom the dream of escaping this burden by buying a home proceeds further and further into the distance every year. So yes, that's why I'm focusing on this video, the renter class. Although, as I've shown, landlords increase prices for homeowners too. The only people profiting from this are the landlords, and everyone but landlords has to live with the consequence. If you're watching this and you're thinking, well, what are we gonna do? Give all the poor people and homeless people free houses? What about me? Well, maybe I didn't forget about you. I wanna give you a house too. I'm gonna give you a house so frickin' bad. Again, nobody wants to just get rid of landlords. We want housing to be a right. We want to end the cycle of poverty and homelessness. Nobody's getting left behind. I know you might be thinking, well, that's not how the world works. Well, things change, Reginald, if you make them, if you stop being a fracking medieval swear word about it. Now, you might
I'm going to have to push back because I'm in the business of abolishing private property and removing the landlord class in perpetuity. And the best way to do that is to expropriate all properties owned by landlords and give them one housing unit free of charge, just like the rest of us. It could be done. So whenever you hear landlords push back and say, but what about me? Well, you're not excluded from this model where everyone gets free housing. And it's just you will no longer be in a position where you can extract so much wealth from your tenants that you capitalize off of the rent gouging that you subject them to in order to enrich yourself. Put your Santa hat on. We know you have one. Ella Jackson. Say please. Just kidding, but really.
Landlords take a risk when they rent. People might not pay rent and then they need to get taken to court. Things get damaged. The landlord has to pay to fix it. Do you want to pay for all those repairs? I would absolutely pay for those things or fix them myself. I've got YouTube. I'd have the money to do it too because I'm not paying rent, and it would be an investment in me with my money from my labor. The same investment the landlord is making in themselves with my money from my labor. Sorry, it's so freaking ridiculous. Like, landlords are like, hey, I have a use. If the fridge breaks, I'll pay someone to fix it. Well, it's your fridge, so of course you'll fix it. Like, I get to take it with me when I leave, and I'm paying you to pay someone else to fix it. You ain't done shit. The landlord doesn't fix the house. They pay a maintenance or repair person to fix the house. Sometimes that's themselves. But usually they pay someone else the least they can as possible with the money I gave them. If the landlord also works as a maintenance person fixing your place, then they should be paid for that. Repairs and maintenance. But if somebody tried to charge me $1,300 a month to pay for the possibility of a repair, I'd find someone else to do it. Just like your bosses are not paying you out of their pocket, they make money off of your labor and then give you a little sliver in return.
Yeah.
It's the same with landlords. They take the profit they're generating off of the renter class and they use it to often shittily repair their own property. As far as landlords assuming risk, which we hear all the time, what's the risk? They might have to use the money they took from renters to pay off damages not covered by insurance. They might lose some of their projected passive profits. Or, worst case, something terrible could happen. They could only own one house instead of multiple. Or even worse, oh my God, I can't even think about it without choking up. They face the risk of having to become renters. Can you imagine if they had to give all their money every month to someone else? If renting's so great, landlords, and they provide such a great service, I don't see the downside. They should want to rent. It's not a risk at all. Even in the middle of a global pandemic, there were no rent freezes. Even if people couldn't pay, they still owed that money eventually. The law and all the systems are ultimately on the landlord's side. cops come to evict you if you don't leave. Often people will say the risk actually might come from the rental property being an investment. If being a landlord is truly supposed to be a risky investment, then it's time you start actually taking some risk and eating the costs. It's time they start taking the burden during hard times, if that's the risk. Or would you say that's too much risk? So really they're just taking a little baby risk. Just a drop. Just a...
The only risk... So the only risk that they are taking are in times of economic downturn like we're experiencing right now, right? Now, they might have some issues with 1 or 2 units if they are refusing to adjust the cost of their rents and it's too much of a burden for a tenant to bear, then they will let their units sit vacant, right? This is called renter speculation, and that, I guess, is a risk, but again, that is a decision that you make as a landlord to not make any adjustments to the market rates of your units that are too high a price for your run-of-the-mill tenant in your area, right? The most risk that you take as a landlord is circumstantial to the times that we are experiencing some sort of economic downturn or an economic recession that makes it impossible for tenants to pay their rents because of their employment status or unemployment status or changes to their employment at all. It's not like your investment will all of a sudden make some sort of, or be subjected to some major market shift if you are purchasing in an up-and-coming neighborhood, which most landlords are making smart investments. They're not just investing property anywhere. They're doing their research. They're looking at market trends and analyses and projections of the new hot up-and-coming areas, which is going to be more so a guarantee that you will have a return on your investment. The only thing that you cannot control for are circumstances like we're in right now, where so many people have lost their jobs because of COVID-19 related economic downturn or a recession, that they can't make their rents. And that is the risk. That is the extent of the risk that landlords that experience, right? Or that they assume. The new hotness? Is that what I said?
Now, I need to say this, and I need you to hear it, please. Even if landlords were taking a risk does not justify the harm they cause to the communities they own property in. Potentially hurting yourself financially is not a moral justification for doing harm. I can hear it now. Cries of, "What about my uncle?" It's the same thing people say about cops when they hear ACAB. What about my uncle? Not every landlord is some real estate mogul. Some have day-to-day jobs, working class like us. My uncle is a landlord. Well, frack your ugly uncle. Everybody works. Shut the frack up. Your uncle has a job. That's fine. So do we. Nobody is saying they shouldn't. We're saying that they're willing to exploit others for their own profit. You don't need to be rich to exploit people. It's the exploitation that's the issue here. And let's not forget, even small-time uncle landlords can work together to prevent tenant organizations and often do work to lobby against regulations being suggested that would be put in place to protect tenants. You can't tell me that you've not personally experienced or had someone very close to you who you trust to be honest experience a really shitty landlord. There are absolute horror stories.
Like literally horror stories.
Yeah, some landlords are small-time business owners, like she-lords.
Just so you know, this isn't satire. I know this looks like something I'd make, but the company and its slogans are real. These ads aren't gonna be, but the company is. The hashtag BossBabeCringe is so embarrassing.
Even some leftists I spoke to said something like, "You're judging people who have to live under capitalism. Hate the game, not the player." To which I reply, you chose to play the game. Nobody is forced under capitalism to be a landlord. Exploitation doesn't get a free pass because you're making money. The actions you take don't exist in a vacuum, but they do speak for themselves sometimes. If you choose to become the exploiter to end your own exploitation, that's a choice you make based on your own morals. And I have every right to judge someone based on their morals. So much for the tolerant oppressed, you might say. Judging someone based on their morals. That's pretty much the only thing you should judge someone for. I don't need to be tolerant of people who are causing harm to benefit themselves. Now, this is around the time somebody usually realizes that I haven't offered any other suggestions, and they're like, "Gotcha, queer. What do you suggest? Because all you've done is complain and criticize and bitch like a little bitch." Well, I have done all those things, and I am all those things. Yeah, you're right. You got me. I'm a little bitch. So, let's do this. I've asked you many times in the past 25 hours that I've been filming this fracking video to imagine a world that's different. A world where housing is a human right. So what might this world I'm talking about look like? Collective reform will eventually involve boring landlords. But how do we get there?
We smash.
Yes, Serengo. Eventually we'll probably have to smash. But while we're still operating under capitalism, we should be taking some steps towards our ultimate vision for a better world for everyone. But what do we do under the current system?
9 months in a row, thank
Well,
you.
personally, I think we need
4
to
months
start
in a
by
row.
helping the most marginalized people under the rule of landlords.
Thanks.
The homeless. Let's take a look at the stats for the city and country I live in. In Toronto, there are 66,000 empty homes. In Toronto, there are 10,000 homeless people. For every homeless person living in Toronto, there are over 6 homes sitting empty. For every homeless person in Canada, there are over 5 empty homes. This doesn't even include housing like apartments or hotel rooms or hostels. In fact, Canada's vacant home rate is 5 times higher than the US, and it's rising. There's no shortage of homes. Let's use them. There's no moral justification for people dying on the street while they're outnumbered by empty houses. Remember, profit isn't a moral justification. You might think, hey, what the frack, Caelan? So I have to rent and homeless people just get a free house? Again, I implore you to think just beyond what you know to be the rules of the way the world works. And imagine how many changes would actually come from putting people before profits. How that would change every interaction we have in society. Nobody is advocating for only helping the homeless, but I mean, go ahead and start there, sure. They need somewhere to go, and studies have shown that supportive housing is far, far cheaper and safer than a shelter bed. Yeah, homes to those without one. But that's not all we want to do. We want to help you too. We're fighting for you, even if you don't believe it. And even if you fight us, a working class person who has been indoctrinated into believing we don't deserve better is not my enemy. And I'm not yours, no matter what you might think. So great. Unhoused are housed. Now what? What's next? Well, we're not going to be able to just K-word the landlords. Just K-word the landlords. Just K-word the landlords. Just K-word the landlords.
I wish my faces would just stop. 'Cause I need something to get to the top. I'm always on the bottom. No, I've always got these problems. No, I'm always on the bottom. No.
Well, we're not going to be able to just K-word the landlords. So we're probably going to have to settle for incremental change. I think the next step would be to protect current renters. Within apartments or condos or communities, that could be a tenants union, where you collectively engage in bargaining with your landlord whilst making sure your rights are protected and performing on the street mutual aid. In September 2020 in Toronto, members of the Goodwood Tenants Union successfully protested and blocked the sheriff coming to change the law on the unit of an Indigenous woman living with severe health issues. Dozens of tenants and supporters took shifts blocking the sheriff. And it worked. Then there's removing the middleman altogether. Things like tenant-owned buildings where tenants pay rent to themselves. So together, collectively, they all pay the property taxes and bills. They might vote on upgrades for their building. They may use their own skills between them to improve the building for everyone. What happens to the building and the tenants is chosen and decided on by the tenants, in the tenants' best interests. Rent would go down because nobody is profiting off the building. The housing exists to house and enrich the lives of the people who live there. And the people who live there have a huge personal motivation to better the property itself. Now, during this plague, we've heard talk about a general rent strike. Most people who are rent burdened simply can't take that risk. After all, renters take on all the real risk. That's how they intend to keep us from collective action. When the risks are too high, because the alternative is homelessness. The power they possess is wholly unearned and so poorly regulated. Change is possible. It's not hopeless. Things can get better, but it requires a real shift in the way people think about housing. It requires people to start to really look at the way they're living and realize that just because it's common, just because it's normalized, doesn't make it right. And just because it's the way it is, doesn't mean that's the way it has to be. There are things we can do, there are changes we can make, but we have to be working together. What would happen if every renter in Toronto joined a tenants union and every renter collectively said no, enough? They have no way to hold on to as much power as they do have right now when the people actually work together. There's so many more of us than there are of them.
That's right.
Talk to the people in your community. Do it online if you feel safer. Look up mutual aid organizations local to you. Help start one. Start group chats, plant the seeds, print off flyers and put them around your area. Get people to start thinking differently, to start questioning the status quo. Because without the support of the general population, we're fucked. Wait, I'd like to give a huge special thanks and shout out to the Red Planet Collective. They're a patron I completely did dirty on my last video by forgetting to put their name in the credits. I'm so sorry. They were super nice and let me know and were so freaking sweet about it, so I owe them.
Pretty impressed. Really good production value. Don't most people aspire to own a home, and isn't that a good thing? People aspire to own a home because it's a waste of money to continue to pay rent if the same amount of money can go toward a mortgage that will ultimately lead to you owning the home outright one day. Yep. Who was that? Conrad. Caelan Conrad. Will there be dragons in newer Amye videos? Maybe. I want to hide my hair and just show these little guys. These little